Now, do you have any question before we start our lesson today? Now, if no, we start our lesson. Now, the topics that we are going to discuss with you is the input and output system, or in short form, you may hear the name of the short form before. It is what we call the I/O system. I/O system. Okay, input and output. Okay. Now, actually, the I/O system are very important to the computer because it helps the computer to have some receive the signal from the environment. At the same time, it can have some response to the environment after it processes the data. Therefore, today we are going to tell you how the computer connects to the external device using the I/O system. Now here we have the contents of this lesson. Firstly, we are going to talk about the I/O problem, and then we are going to talk about the modules and functions provided by the I/O system, and the I/O techniques we will describe. Okay, now actually, when we describe the Arduino system and also the SHES3317 tutorial, you may find the microprocessor or the CPU can connect to the external device using some interface such as the SPI, I2C, UART, etc., etc. Now they are the nowadays they are the commonly used technique to make the control. Okay, actually we don't talk the others because they are outdated. Because I think nowadays we may not encounter that kind of interface, such as the serial port, the parallel port, the SCSI interface, etc., etc. But we keep the subject become modern. Therefore, in here you may find that we talk about the USB, which nowadays it should be the most popular interface technique for the computer to connect to the external device. And also we are going to in these techniques we also talk about a very important hardware or external device handling technique, so-called interrupt. And again, we have already give you some idea before when we talk about the Arduino or the H051. So we give you more details on this part. Okay. Now for the I/O problems, now it is because we actually want to connect many devices to the computer, and they have various requirements. For example, they may have different amounts of data. You may see when I connect a mouse or a video cam, the data rates for the transmission from the device to the computer are different, right? So you can see that they have different amounts of data to be transferred. They are operate at different speeds. Okay, for example, the video cam should have a higher operating speed than the mouse because it try to capture the video sequence and display on the screen of the computer. So you may imagine how the operating speed of the video cam you have. Okay, compare with the mouse, it only sends to you the mouse cursor position which require a slower speed. And they have the different format. Actually, they have different protocol in communicating with the computer. Okay. Now, therefore, in the past, we may say that to make the communication with the external hardware is really difficult because we have different design in the I/O system. But nowadays, as we told you that we solve the problem by using a one and only one single interface to connect to the external hardware. It is the USB. Okay. Now, without USB, you may consider that this topic is a very large topic because we needed to talk about many different type of connection between the computer and the hardware. But now, because the invention of the USB, we may find that now to connect or to control the external hardware become very easy. Okay. Now, for the external hardware, normally they are slower than CPU and RAM. Normally, in the computer, the highest speed should be what operating speed should be the CPU. But nowadays, another device, the GPU, it runs at a higher speed than the CPU because the data it is going to process is larger than that of CPU. Therefore, we may find that normally CPU should have the highest speed, but you may consider that the GPU may have a higher speed than the CPU. Now, as a result, we need the I/O modules to help us to control the hardware. Okay. Now here we have a diagram to for explaining or to give you a diagram about the I/O module. And actually you can see that it is only a board diagram and it tells you the functions of the I/O module. Here you can see that it makes the connection to the system bus. It connects to the address bus, data bus, and also the control bus because it is going to connect to the CPU and the memory. Normally, after the I/O modules receive the data from the external hardware, it will send the data to the CPU or the memory. And the CPU normally it will give the external hardware the control signal through the control bus. Okay. And on the other hand, you can see that it is connecting to the external hardware. It can connect more than one peripherals. Okay. And actually, you can see that the I/O modules look like a middleman. Okay. Between the computer and also the external hardware. Okay. Now it is only the generic model for the I/O module. What is inside? Now we will tell you. Now for the external device, now it can be classified into this diagram. You can see that normally it contains a control logic so that it receives the control signal from the CPU or to give out the signal to let the CPU what happens for the external module through the status sent to the CPU. The control signal may come from the CPU, therefore you may consider that it may ask the hardware to read, to write, or do anything. And on the other hand, for the status, it may return to the CPU by saying, oh, the hardware is buffer full, okay? or it is still not ready because it is under operation. Okay, and you can see that inside the external device, it normally contains a buffer because it will control a transducer. Now, transducer, it is a device that to sense the environment using a sensor or a actuator. Actuator means it is going to put or apply some response to the environment. Okay, they are known as the transducer, so that they can convert the electrical signal. Okay, now the physical signal can be converted into electrical signal through the transducer and then pass safe in the buffer, and then it can pass to the computer. Okay. On the other hand, if it is going to give the response to the environment, it will make the data to convert the electrical signal into some physical signal that it can pass to the environment. Okay. And here we have some example for the external device that you may get familiar with. You have human readable device such as screen, printer, and keyboard that you may use them every day. You may have the machine readable device, for example, for monitoring and control. For example, you may connect an intelligent video camera to the computer, and this device or camera can automatically detect the intrusion. That means if you have a stranger walk around into your room, the camera will automatically send an alarm to the computer to let the user know there is a problem. Okay, therefore it facilitates the machine-to-machine communication. And also, normally nowadays we are talking about the communication for the computer is important due to without using the internet, no one want to use the computer, right? Therefore, for communication device, we have modem or some network interface, network card installed into the computer to make the communication between the computer and the internet. Okay, and the normal structure can be consist of this found in the diagram. Okay. Now here we show you the different speed for the external device. You can see from the diagram, normally the gigabit Ethernet running at the highest speed. In this diagram, it is around 10 to the power 9, that means 1 gigabit. And actually, nowadays, this diagram is not so updated because you may hear about the 10 gigabit Ethernet has appeared in the computer market. Okay, therefore you can see that the speed for the Ethernet should be the highest. Next to that, you have the graphic display, which nowadays it is running at again 10 gigabit per second. Because the graphics or video card nowadays it plays a very important role in the computer. For example, if the user playing a video game, actually the graphic card will render the computer graphics for the game in order to give a good experience when for the user to play the game. Therefore, the graphic card should be running at a very fast speed. Okay. Next to it, you can find we have the hard disk. Again, it is running at a high speed because it stores the user data. If it is low, it becomes the bottleneck of the computer. When the user open a file, he or she may wait for a long time it makes the user become annoying, right? Next to it, you have Ethernet, optical disc, scanner, laser printer, etc., etc. You can see that the operating speed becomes lower. Okay. Now this is from this diagram you can see that why I told you it is really difficult to design the hardware or the I/O module to control the hardware because they are operating at different speed. Okay. But luckily nowadays we have USB, and if later I will give you the specification of the USB, you can find that the USB actually running at a very fast speed. It can entertain the Ethernet communication. So by emulating different speed, okay, for the hardware, it can sustain or we use or apply to control the different hardware we listed in here. Okay, therefore it solves our many of our problems by using the USB to connect to the other device. Now we talk about the I/O module function. Now inside the I/O module, you may see that we told you it is a middleman between the computer and the hardware. Therefore, you can see that on the left-hand side, it connects to the computer. That it has a data lines, address lines, and control lines. Okay. The address line and control line, it will directly connect to the I/O logic for control. Okay. And for the data line, normally we consist of some data registers or memory to temporarily store the data from the CPU or the hardware. Okay, therefore, it provide the user or the computer the data register, and also it show the status. Okay, and remember that later I will told you that when the computer want to control the external hardware, it will write a command into the data register. Okay, and at the same time it will read the status of the hardware from the status register. Okay, therefore it makes the control become easier. Okay, remember in Arduino we told you that remember in the example, the pressure sensor example, we write the data to a register or read a data from the register in order to control or read the signal from the external device. And it is very convenient to do that. Now, in the middle, you have the I/O logic. We talk about that it is mainly control the external hardware. Therefore, it send the signal to the logic interface for the hardware. And because the I/O module can connect to many external devices, therefore we repeat the structure for the interface logic, where it receive the signal, receive the data from the device or send the data to the device. It receives the status from the hardware, or it gives the control signal to the hardware. Okay. Now this I/O module, now it mainly used to control the hardware, especially it will give the timing to the hardware, because nowadays most of our device working in a synchronous approach, so that both the computer and the hardware can operate in the same clock. Therefore, the I/O module will provide a proper timing signal to the hardware in order to control the hardware. It facilitates the CPU and device communications. As we told you, it will store the data using the data buffering. And also, it is responsible for the error detection because when the problem appear in the hardware, it will send a status signal to the CPU through the I/O module. Now here we told you the I/O steps, how the I/O module control the hardware. Now firstly, the CPU will check the I/O module status using the status register. Okay, it will if something wrong, the CPU will load the hardware problem through the status register. And then the I/O module returns the status into the status registers. And if the CPU require to have the data transfer, it will read whether the I/O module is ready. And then if it is ready, the CPU requests the data. And then the I/O module will get the data from the device and then further will transfer the data to the CPU. Okay. Now actually, the CPU will access the I/O module using these 5 steps. Okay, but for some special hardware, it may require some other device that we will told you later. For example, if the I/O module require to write or read a large amount of data from the memory or to the memory, it may require another device, so-called the DMA, the Direct Memory Access, that it can write or read the data directly to the memory. Okay, now we will give you some idea for this one. Okay, now for the I/O module decision, now actually when you design a I/O modules, now what are the design consideration? Now firstly, whether you are going to hide or review, that means show the device property to the CPU. Now from the point of view from the CPU, actually it can see the I/O modules only, but not the hardware. Okay, so for the I/O module, do you want to have a direct control to the hardware? Okay, it become one of the consideration. Okay, and naturally some of the hardware require direct control. For example, the video card. Okay, because through the I/O module, it may be very slow because you have many overhead or the physical delay that make the control become slow. Therefore, we may have some design to direct control the video. For example, one of the technologies, so-called the DirectX, come from the Microsoft. It can make the computer directly control the video web memory. Okay, and it can help to improve the speed of the hardware. And therefore, you needed to think about that whether you want to let the CPU to load the hardware properties directly. Okay, if low, you can hire the properties of the hardware. Okay. Second, you may consider that whether it can support the multiple or single device. Okay, if you are going to support the multiple device, you needed to solve the problem on how the signal is sending to the proper device from the I/O module, or the speed of the I/O module you needed to consider because because the I/O module, it is a middleman, and now it is serving for many devices, and the service to the device become slower. Therefore, you should guarantee the speed should be fast enough to serve the I/O hardware when you connect to the multiple device. Okay. The third point is that whether you are going to have the control device function by the I/O module itself or leave for the CPU. Okay. Now, because as we told you before, now normally when we control the hardware will provide you some register. Okay. When you are going to control the hardware, you are going to write something to the register and the hardware will respond. So if it is the control is under this method, you can simply write the data to the register directly. Therefore, you can have a direct control to the hardware by the CPU. On the other hand, if you rely on the I/O module, that means you needed to have a mapping from the I/O module to the hardware, so that every time the CPU, when it write to this register, it will copy to the hardware to have the control. Okay. Therefore, you needed to consider whether you want to directly control by the CPU or control by the hardware I/O module. The next, we needed to consider the operating system, because some of the operating system may treat the hardware as a file. Therefore, you needed to fit or design your I/O module to fit into this approach. Therefore, we have many things to design when we design a I/O module. But nowadays, as we told you, we always use USB today. Therefore, it reduces our problem actually. Now, next we are going to talk about the I/O techniques. So far, we have 4 types of I/O techniques: the programmed I/O, polling, interrupt-driven, and the direct memory access. Okay, now they are some commonly used techniques that we encounter nowadays in the I/O module, and we are going to talk about each of them. Now, the first technique, it is the polling. Now, actually, the polling method, now you can see the sentence that the CPU will sequentially access the device connected to the computer. Okay, if a particular device requires the surface of the CPU, the device will acknowledge to the CPU about the surface, and then the CPU will serve the device. Okay. Now, actually, during the device polling, you can see the peripheral acknowledge to the CPU that the peripheral required to send the data, and afterwards, the CPU control the peripheral by sending the read command to the address of the peripheral. Okay. Now, the after the surface is acknowledged, so that the device want to send the data to the CPU, the methods are common to all the I/O technique. Okay. Now, but before the I/O device send the data, the difference for the I/O technique is that in polling, the CPU will periodically ask the device whether you want to have the data transfer. Okay. Now, just like in the classroom, like if the teacher or the lecturer asks every question at a fixed interval, that I ask student A whether you have problem, and then ask student B whether you have a problem, ask student C whether you have a problem, until I will ask all of the students in the class and before I continue my job. Okay, so this is polling. That means I will ask everyone to see whether you have a problem. Okay, if you have a problem, I will answer you. If no, I will continue ask the other student. Okay, now the situation is exactly the same for using the polling. Okay, now therefore you can see that by using this approach, the advantage is that every device have a chance to be served. Now, however, the disadvantage for the polling method is that it wastes the CPU time in asking the device. Okay, now so that for most of the device, they may not require the service. Just like for most of you may not have a problem immediately to ask me. Therefore, it may waste the CPU time by using the polling method. Okay. Now, therefore, the polling method it is not good. We needed to have the other method. Now, another method it is the programmed I/O. Now, actually, for the program I/O, it means the I/O module. Actually, from the CPU point of view, it is embedded in the hardware. Okay, virtually, the CPU cannot see the I/O module, so that it can have a direct control over the I/O or the hardware. It can receive the signal, send the read-write command, and transfer data to or from the hardware directly. Okay. And therefore, by using this approach, the CPU should wait for the I/O module to complete the operation. And again, it wastes the CPU time because when the CPU is control the hardware, normally it cannot doing the other thing. Okay, but nowadays it can because later I will tell you nowadays the CPU design support multiple core. Okay, dual core, quad core, etc. And you may think about that the CPU can ask one of the core to serve the I/O, right? So programmed I/O can be allowed in the modern design of the computer system. Okay. Now for the operation, you can see that the program I/O it will request the I/O operation, and then the I/O module will perform the operations. It will set the status bit to let the CPU know what happened to the hardware, and the CPU will check the status bits periodically, so that whenever it found a problem, it will fix the problem. And now during the operation, the I/O module will not inform the CPU directly. It only set the status bit. Therefore, the I/O module does not interrupt the CPU. It's just like the polling. Okay, the CPU will check the status whether it is functioning properly, and then it will continue the execution. Okay, and therefore the CPU may wait or come back later to check the status to see the CPU finish the data transfer or require some other control. And actually, it is not a good method to control the hardware because it still wastes the CPU time. Okay. Now, what are the I/O commands that can be sent to the hardware? Actually, it will issue the address to identify the module. And nowadays, as I told you that the I/O or the external hardware, when connected to the computer will give the I/O an address. This approach it is so-called the memory mapped I/O. Actually, from the point of view, the CPU will look the I/O module look like a memory because it has an address. Okay, it gives the address to the I/O, and the I/O will give the CPU the data, so it looks like a memory. Okay, and the CPU will issue the command so that it will tell the module what to do. For example, spin up the disk. If it is a hard disk, it will check the status, whether it is power on or error, and it may control the device to have the read or write the data. Okay. And for the addressing I/O device, for the I/O program, the I/O, the data transfer look like the memory from the CPU point of view, and each device will given the unit identifier so that it has unit address, and the CPU command will contain the address in order to access the proper I/O. Okay. Therefore, we have told you it is what we call the memory mapped I/O. The device and memory share the memory space. The I/O look like the memory, therefore it can have read-write control, and it does not require any special command for I/O. And normally, the I/O will provide the CPU a register or some registers to control the hardware that we have already told you. Okay. And actually, it can support. It may make the machine code or the assembly language become more complicated because you needed to design the control of the hardware in your assembly language. Okay, therefore, you should make sure the memory access command available to the I/O also. Now, other than that, you may using the isolated I/O. That means you may have a separate I/O bus. For the memory, you have the separate memory bus for data and address. For separate I/O, that means they have separate address space, and they have different I/O and memory select lines. And this time, you may have some special command for I/O. Okay, therefore it may have limit sets. That means not all the memory access command can be applied to here. Remember, in the assembly language, we have different addressing mode. Okay, for designing the I/O, you may not require to that kind of complicated addressing mode. Therefore, you can trim out all unused addressing mode in your assembly language design. Okay. Now, for the separate I/O, it make the design become simple because you have separate control. Okay. But when writing the assembly language or writing a program to control the hardware, it may become more specific. Okay, and it make the program become less portable because every time when you port to another system, you need to write another program if you are using the separated I/O. Okay, now so far, do you have any question? If you have, you can post it in the chat room. Okay. Now nowadays, the most frequently used in I/O technique, it is the interrupt, because it helps to overcome the CPU waiting problem. By using the interrupt, the CPU waits less time, we found, and it does not repeat the CPU checking of the device, because when the I/O modules require the service, it sends the interrupt signal to the CPU and asks the CPU to serve the I/O. Okay? And in the interrupt, the basic operation you have the CPU read issue the read command to the I/O. For example, it asks the I/O module to read some data to the CPU, and the I/O module get the data. Okay, but at this time, the CPU can do the other works because it does not wait the I/O. Okay? When the I/O module get the data from the hardware, it will send the signal to the CPU, At that time, the CPU stop the current execution, okay, and the CPU will serve the interrupt by requesting the data, and at that time, the I/O module can transfer the data to the CPU. Okay. Now, by using this approach, most importantly, is that the CPU does not need to wait for the I/O. Therefore, it can do another thing, and you can see that it enables the parallelism for the computer operations, so that the computer and the hardware can operate at the same time. Now, from the CPU point of view, now it will read the command. In other words, it will check the interrupt at the end of the instruction cycle. Okay. If the interrupt is found, it will save the context. That means it is using the push instruction to save all of the current content to the memory. And then it processes the interrupt. And normally, the interrupt will attach with the interrupt services routine. Okay, and normally we call it the ISR, okay, interrupt service routine. And at that time, it will fetch the code for the interrupt service routine, and then it will store, transmit the data, and then store the data to the memory or hard disk. Okay. So, what is the design issue on the interrupt? The first one is how you identify the module issuing the interrupt. So, actually, it is referred to the address of the I/O module or I/O hardware. And normally, the CPU will assign a number in the form of IRQ, interrupt routine interrupt request number. Okay, just like the address of the memory. And then by checking the IRQ, you can know which device is asking the service. And how will you deal with the multiple interrupts? Okay, we will have some approach, and actually we will let you know if we have multiple interrupts, how can the CPU handle them. And actually we told you that we have the interrupt handler attached to each interrupt to serve the interrupt routine. Now, how we can identify the interrupt module? We have different lines to connect to the module. Okay, so we have the program counter. It will jump to the each module, and it can have the limited number of devices. And actually, the I/O module can using the software pole, so that remember, the I/O module can connect to many devices. For example, it has 4 devices A, B, C, D. By using the software pole, it will ask A whether it has interrupt, B whether it has interrupt, C whether it has interrupt, and D whether it has interrupt, etc., etc. Just like to what we told you in polling, but this time it is done by I/O module, not CPU. Okay. However, this approach may be slow, or it may also let the CPU ask the device directly. Or the I/O module somehow will support the daisy chain. Now, the daisy chain means that the I/O module contains only one connection to the hardware, and it will further connect to another hardware using a chain connections. And therefore, by using the daisy chain, the signal will bypass to each device so that the signal can be reached to all of the devices in the chain. Therefore, this is a hardware pole so that the signal will be sent out to all the chain, and the interrupt acknowledge will send down to the chain, and the corresponding module will respond to the bus by putting the data in the form of a vector. A vector means a data, actually. Okay, and you may see that it will create a vector. For example, I have 6 devices. Every time when this device requires the interrupt, it will set the bit. For example, C and F require the interrupt, then it set the bit. The other is 0. And this vector will be sent back to the I/O module and then to the CPU to ask the CPU to serve. Okay? Therefore, the CPU will use the vector to identify the handler routine because it should know, for example, C and F, after we receive the vector, it will know they require the service. Okay? Or now we may have a one control using a bus master. Actually, in this approach, you may consider that every I/O device is connecting to it in a bus. Okay, so whenever it connects to the bus. So when the device wants to send the data, it will clean the bus before it raises the interrupt. This approach normally appears in the PCI bus or SCSI bus. Now here we show you the instruction cycle that we told you in our lecture 1. Actually, for the instruction to be executed in the CPU, we say that we first calculate the address in the program counter, and then fetch the instruction, decode the instruction, and then it will first fetch the operand by calculating the address, and then fetch the address, and then perform the operation. If the destination needed to have calculate, we needed to have another calculation on the address, and then store the address. Okay, now this is what we told you before. Okay, but how the interrupt can be added to this diagram? Now I will tell you later. Now for the interrupt, it is the mechanism by which the other modules may interrupt to the normal sequence of processing. For example, when the program execution, it has the overflow, division by 0, etc., that the program cannot continue. Then it will return or send a signal to the CPU to ask for help. The timer signal, because as I told you, some of the hardware require to have synchronous control. Therefore, normally the CPU will provide the timer, and it will send an interrupt signal to ask the CPU to serve. Okay. Actually, every CPU contains a timer in order to synchronous control the other hardware. Okay. Or the timer may using nowadays a very popular idea in computer. It is the multitasking, because by dividing the CPU time to different different application in a very fast speed, then it appears to the user it is doing a multitasking. Okay. For example, in here, the CPU running 3 applications. If the CPU switch to each of the applications at a very fast speed, then virtually from the user point of view, it looks like the CPU is parallelly running 3 applications, right? It is multitasking. Therefore, it is enabled by using a timer. Now the I/O that we told you before, the hardware require the control. Or lastly, we have the hardware failure. It will check the status about the memory priority error. That means the data stored in the memory is wrong. Therefore, we needed to fix the problem. Now here we have the program flow control for different approach. Now on the left hand side, you have the low interrupt approach. You can see that now your user program is divided into 5 parts. And inside your program, you are going to write the data to the I/O. Therefore, it requires the I/O program. You can see that the operation is that starting from the program, it will execute program fragment 1, and then write, it will jump to program fragment 4, and then wait for the I/O command, and then program fragment 5, and then after finishing the I/O, it return, and then continue execution of program fragment 2. After that, it has the second write, therefore it jump to the program segment 4 again, and then I/O command, program fragment 5, and then return, and then continue execution to the program fragment 3, and then a write command also. Okay. Now you can see that without the interrupt, the CPU will stop. Okay, during the write I/O. Therefore, it wastes the CPU time. On the other hand, if you apply the interrupt, if the I/O wait is not short, you can see that again, the user program will be starting from program fragment 1, and then write, it will jump to the I/O program 4. But at the same time, when the I/O is doing the I/O command here, the main program will continue execute the program segment 2 specified by 2A. And after the I/O is completed at this time, it will send an interrupt at here. Therefore, the CPU will stop executing the current program, and it will jump to serve the program segment 5. And after it is completed, it will return. Okay, and the cycle will be repeated, and it will the second write will be jumped to program fragment 4, and the main program will continue execution until 3A. It will handle program fragment 5, and then doing the program fragment 3B. Okay, now you can see that by using this approach, the CPU can save its time to execute some of the main program. Okay, at the same time, the I/O is doing the I/O operations. Therefore, we found that this approach is more efficient. And if you have a long I/O waiting, no problem. You can see that the program after write, it will make ask the program to execute the I/O program fragment 4. It will doing the I/O. At the same time, the program will execute the program fragment 2. Okay, without any stop. So, and at the second write, it will have a handle the interrupt, and then before it asks the second write, therefore it continue. After the program fragment 5 of the first interrupt has been completed, it will make the second call to the I/O program. Again, it will jump to program fragment 4 again, doing the I/O at the same time. The main program is working on the program memory, and the cycle will be repeated. After the I/O completed, it will handle the program memory files come from the interrupt routine. Okay, again, you can see that without waiting the I/O, the CPU can continue the execution of the main program, and it can save the resources of the CPU. And therefore, this is why we told you that we're using interrupt nowadays. Okay. Okay. Now I think before we move on, we can take a short break, and we will continue at 1 line 35. Okay.